In the winter of 1844, when the comet of Halley still smeared the sky like a wet thumbprint on sooty glass, a coffin was carried into the dissecting theater of the Medical College of Charleston and laid upon the marble sink where the blood of yesterday's subjects had not yet dried. The lid had warped. A faint odor of brine, lamp oil, and something sharper, like newly split chestnut, rose from the crack. Outside, the courtyard rang with the iron clatter of wagon chains, but inside the theater the only motion was the slow rotation of a ceiling fan turned by a Negro boy who had been told to keep the air moving so the white gentleman would not faint. The professor, a Dr. Erasmus Bell, stood with one palm spread on the wood as though feeling for a pulse that had no right to exist. He had paid $200 in gold for the corpse, a price that made the students murmur, because no cadaver, black or white, had ever fetched more than 30. When the lid came free, the body that lay in the yellow lamplight was so undamaged, so composed, that one apprentice later wrote in a letter, never posted, that it seemed to be listening to the lecture that was about to begin. The dead man's lips carried the faintest curve upward, the way a child smiles when he has solved a puzzle in secret. His wrists were unmarked by irons, his back unmapped by the lash. Only a single incision, neat as a violin string, circled the crown of his skull where the saw would enter. Dr. Bell lifted the right hand, slender, almost feminine, and turned it so the lamplight caught the ridge of callus that riding reins leave, then let it fall again. The windows had begun to fog. Someone drew a finger across the pane, leaving a clear streak that narrowed like an eye. In that streak, the city's reflection trembled. Cupolas, masts, the black ribbon of the Ashley River, and the low roof of Workhouse No. 3 from which this body had been stolen only hours after death. The name on the toe tag, tied with courthouse twine, was Daniel King, property of Mrs. A. But the tag was smudged, as if someone had sucked the ink away with a greedy mouth, and beneath the name, in the same ink, another hand had later written a single Greek word, Sophos, wisdom. The fan clicked, the boy coughed once, and Dr. Bell, who had dissected 300 Africans without once asking their names, felt the sudden certainty that the corpse already knew the syllabus better than he did. He postponed the dissection until morning, had the body locked in the chemical vault, and went home to dream of a library whose books bled when opened. In the vault, the temperature sank. The preservatives thickened. Somewhere inside the skull, a thought that had refused to die waited patiently for the saw's first kiss. The King plantation lay south of the Ashley, 12 miles by river, where the land swells into low marine terraces older than any deed. The house, built in 1809, had been modeled on a print of Lime Hall, 4 chimneys, a portico whose pillars were fluted like the bones of giants. By 1844 the rice had failed twice, the price of gold had risen, and Mrs. Adelaide King, widow of the late judge, had sold off 2/3 of the original tract to keep the wallpaper dry. She lived now with one house girl, a cook, a driver, and the remainder of her human inventory. 41 souls, among them the boy Daniel, purchased in 1832 from a failing indigo concern for $87 and a broken barometer. No one had remarked the transaction at the time. The child was slight, bow-legged, and his eyes, yellowish in the iris, seemed always to be watching something behind the buyer's shoulder. But within a year, the boy had been observed tracing letters in spilled cornmeal while memorizing the entire dinner conversation of the White family, repeating it later in the quarters with such accuracy that the other bondsmen began to call him Mr. By 10, he could calculate the weight of a rice barrel from its shadow, predict the next eclipse to the hour, and recite, in faultless French, the Declaration of the Rights of Man, though no one could explain where he had heard French at all. Mrs. King, who prided herself on a rational Christianity, attempted to have the peculiarity beaten out of him. The driver broke 2 switches without extracting a cry. Yet the learning only nested deeper. At night, he unscrewed the brass nameplate from the parlor clock and studied the gear ratios by candle end. By winter, he had built a smaller clock from barrel staves and pewter spoons, whose tick could be heard inside the big house after midnight, a heartbeat that belonged to no living thing. When the judge died of a stroke in 1837, Daniel was seen to open the window of the sick room and hold a prism into the dawn. A bar of colored light fell across the dead man's eyes, and for an instant the corpse seemed to focus. Adelaide declared the moment blasphemous and ordered the prism flung into the river, but the next morning the object lay dry on the pantry shelf, its edges bright as new teeth. In 1840, a circuit preacher lodging overnight borrowed the boy to lead his horse. The preacher later told the widow that while crossing the marsh, the Negro had spoken of the Pleiades as if he had been their tutor, naming the stars in Arabic, then asking whether the preacher believed light could remember the shape of the eye that first received it. Adelaide answered with a verse about the curse of Ham and doubled the field quotas. Yet even she began to dream of the boy, dreams in which he stood at the foot of her bed, reading aloud from a ledger whose entries were the dates of her own decay. Each morning she woke to find a single black hair coiled on her counterpane, though Daniel's head was kept shaved in the workhouse. In 1843, she attempted to sell him. 3 separate buyers rode away within minutes of meeting the boy, one claiming that the Negro's reflection in the horse trough had no mouth. Adelaide locked Daniel in the rice barn with a Bible and a lantern, instructing the driver to feed him through a hatch. On the 7th night, the barn caught fire. Flames green as copper salts leapt from the ridgepole, and when the roof collapsed, the slaves swore they saw the boy walking upright along the falling beam, arms out, pages of the holy book swirling about him like burning swans. He emerged from the ashes without a blister, carrying in his cupped hands a quantity of ash that, when sifted the next day, revealed a perfect white sphere the size of an eyeball. After that, the other Negroes would not meet his gaze. They said he had learned the last thing a slave must never know, how to be present in more than one place at once. Adelaide, her rice mortgaged, her credit thinning, consulted a Charleston physician who dabbled in ethnology. The physician offered to remove the boy's curiosity by trepanation, gratis, in the name of science. She agreed, then hesitated, then agreed again, then dreamt that Daniel stood over her surgery reading her own obituary aloud. When she woke, the physician had been found in his own dissecting room, his calipers driven through the palm of his left hand into the deal table beneath, pinning him like a moth while he bled to death. No Negro was seen leaving. Adelaide locked the doors, dismissed the physician's offer, and told the driver that if the boy spoke again, ever, he was to be hung from the pecan tree without trial. Daniel said nothing for 419 days. Then, on the night of 8th December 1844, he spoke once more, and the plantation began to die in earnest. Charleston in 1844 was already a city of tombs. The yellow fever pits of 1822 still sank beneath new pavements. The workhouse on Magazine Street received the idle black poor and returned them as cadavers for the college. The streets smelled of hemp, indigo, and the sour breath of the rice fleets. Science flourished beside the slave pens. Dr. Erasmus Bell had studied in Philadelphia under Dr. Samuel Morton, measuring skulls with buckshot to prove the lesser volume of African minds. He had published a monograph arguing that the Negro's optic nerve was too short to see distant sorrow, and therefore required a nearer, more intimate cruelty. Yet even Bell had begun to dream of the same library that haunted Adelaide King, shelves of flayed spines, a catalog rustling like wings. He woke each morning with the taste of iron in his mouth and the conviction that somewhere in the city a book was being written with his own blood for ink. When the sheriff offered him the corpse of a recently executed slave, an anatomical rarity, unmarked by disease, Bell paid without haggling, though the price was 6 times the usual. The body was delivered at dusk in a pine box that seemed too light, as though the inhabitant had left behind only an echo. The driver who brought it would not enter the college yard. He sat his mule at the gate, hat pulled low, and would not speak even to count the coin. Later, when Bell tried to recall the man's face, he could summon only the image of a knot tied in a black cord, tightening of its own accord. The corpse was Daniel King, though the name meant nothing to the professor. The death warrant stated that the prisoner had been convicted of composing a letter, an act of literacy punishable by hanging under the Negro Act of 1740. The letter itself, confiscated and filed in the courthouse, was never read aloud at trial. The presiding magistrate had declared that the words were of such subtle malevolence that to speak them might unmake the barrier between bondage and revolt. Instead, the sheet was folded into a lead tube and nailed to the gallows post, there to corrode unread. Daniel climbed the ladder without assistance. Witnesses agreed that he smiled, and that the rope appeared to knot itself before the hangman touched it, a symmetry noted by the city clock. And when the body ceased its convulsions, the sun passed behind a cloud shaped like an open book. 8 hours later, the corpse was cut down, carted to the college, and locked in the chemical vault whose walls were 3 bricks thick and lined with zinc. Bell, eager to begin, found the body still warm. He attributed the phenomenon to the vault's insulation, though the thermometer read 41 degrees. All night he heard a ticking from behind the iron door, a sound identical to the homemade clock that still haunted Adelaide King's parlor, though that house lay 12 miles away and the clock itself had been flung into the river years earlier. At dawn, Bell opened the vault. The corpse lay unchanged, but the air inside smelled of rice fields at midday, a smell that should have been impossible in December. A single black hair, fine as a spider's thread, curled on the cadaver's brow. When Bell lifted it with forceps, it contracted, then melted into a dot of ink that stained the instrument indelibly. The professor felt, for the first time in his career, the presence of a mind inside the skull that awaited him, not a soul, nothing so vulgar as a ghost, but a deliberate intelligence that had chosen to remain. He postponed the dissection, locked the door again, and went to consult the college librarian, a Mr. Grimke, known to traffic in forbidden texts. Grimke listened, poured 2 glasses of Madeira, and replied that he had once seen a slave in the workhouse scratch a theorem into the wall, a theorem that later proved to predict the exact hour of the man's own death. He offered Bell a folio wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were pages torn from the confiscated letter of Daniel King, the ink faded to the color of dried blood. Grimke had bribed a courthouse janitor the night before the execution. Bell carried the pages back to his rooms, lit a lamp, and began to read. The second sentence was a coordinate in 3 dimensions. When Bell plotted it on a chart of the city, it intersected the vault where the corpse lay. The third sentence was a date. 11th of December, 1844, the day after the hanging, the day of the proposed dissection. The final sentence was not words but a diagram, a Mobius strip twisted through a fourth axis, annotated with the Greek phrase apeiron skotos, infinite darkness. Bell looked up to find the lamp flame had bent horizontal, feeding on air that was no longer in the room. Somewhere below, the vault door sighed open of its own accord. The professor descended the stairs, folio in hand, and found the cadaver sitting upright on the marble sink, head inclined, as though waiting for the lecture to begin. The skull incision had already been made, a perfect circle, the bone lifted away like a lid. Inside, the brain pulsed faintly, lit from within by a network of veins that spelled, in luminous thread, the same Greek word, sophos. Bell felt his knees unhinge. The corpse turned its face toward him, slowly, as if the neck were a balance scale weighing every second it was about to steal. The fan above clicked once, twice, then stopped. In the silence, the city's bells began to toll 11, though sunrise was still an hour away. Each stroke of the bell felt like a vertebra cracking in Bell's spine. When the count reached 11, the corpse lay down again, the skull cap settled into place with a soft click, and the vault door swung shut. Bell found himself outside in the corridor, folio gone, shoes filled with blood though his feet were whole. He never remembered climbing the stairs. In his rooms, the lamp had righted itself. The flame burned vertical, but the wick was consumed to ash. Yet the light persisted, feeding on nothing, like the smile that had stayed on a dead man's face. Adelaide King learned of the resurrection, though no such word was spoken, through a dream in which her own reflection stepped out of the mirror and pressed a cold coin into her palm. She woke to find the coin real, a 1799 Liberty silver dollar, minted the year her husband was born, stopped with a hole punched neatly through the throat of Liberty's profile. The same morning, the driver found the pecan tree bare of leaves, though autumn had ended weeks ago. The ground beneath was littered with nuts cracked open, the meats removed, the shells arranged in rows that spelled, in Roman numerals, the date of her own birth. She rode to Charleston that afternoon, leaving the plantation under the supervision of the cook, a woman who had once served as conjure woman to the Gold Coast hands. The cook watched the mistress depart, then walked to the rice barn and locked the door from the inside. She was found weeks later, seated upright, having woven her own hair into a noose that suspended her just short of the rafter, her toes brushing the ash of the old fire. Adelaide, unaware, crossed the Ashley on the ferry, accompanied by the house girl Ruth, a quadroon of 14 who had never before been allowed off the property. Ruth carried a carpet bag containing the widow's black silk, a jar of rose water, and the judge's derringer loaded with a single brass nail. Adelaide had not explained the errand, but Ruth understood that they were going to retrieve something the widow had lost and could not name. The city received them with its usual stink: horse dung, rotting cotton, the sweet breath of the sugar refineries. Adelaide went first to the courthouse to demand the return of her property, alive or dead. The clerk, a thin man with ink permanently etched into the creases of his fingers, replied that the body had already been claimed by the college, as permitted by an ordinance of 1833. Adelaide insisted on seeing the sheriff. The sheriff, newly elected and eager to appear humane, offered instead to accompany her to the medical school and negotiate a decent burial, though privately he wondered what bargain one strikes with a professor who has already paid in gold. They arrived at twilight, the sky over the harbor the color of a healing bruise. Bell met them in the dissecting theater, face the hue of old tallow, eyes red as if he had not slept since the night the corpse spoke. Adelaide demanded restitution. Bell offered her the money back, then twice the money, then thrice, each refusal more frantic, until at last he opened the vault and revealed the body unchanged, the skull cap neatly replaced, the incision invisible. Adelaide looked down at the face she had last seen in the rice barn, the face that had burned yet not burned, and felt the floor tilt beneath her boots. She reached to touch the cheek. The flesh was cold but resilient, like wax that remembers the shape of the candle. Behind her, Ruth began to hum a tune the girl had never heard, an air in minor key, each note separated by the interval of a heartbeat. The corpse opened its eyes. Not the eyes that had been closed by the hangman. These were darker. The pupils dilated to the rim, reflecting the vaulted ceiling in perfect miniature, so that the onlookers appeared to be staring up at themselves from the bottom of a well. Bell staggered back. The sheriff crossed himself. Adelaide felt the silver dollar in her pocket grow warm enough to scorch the seam of her skirt. The corpse did not move again, but the message was already delivered. Ownership had changed hands. Adelaide, without speaking, turned and walked out. Ruth lingered a moment, then placed the carpet bag on the marble sink, opened it, and removed the derringer. She laid the weapon beside the body, barrel pointing toward the heart that no longer beat. Then she followed her mistress into the night. Behind them, the vault door closed with the softness of a book shutting on its final page. Outside, the city's lamps flickered once, all together, as if the same breath had blown them out. In the harbor, a steamer sounded its whistle. The note held, then cracked, like a bell breaking from the inside. They spent the night in a boarding house whose keeper asked no questions, but in the morning the widow's hair had turned the color of ash, and Ruth spoke with a voice that seemed to come from a room far older than the building itself. They returned to the plantation on foot, crossing the frozen marsh at low tide, the cordgrass rattling like bones in a cup. Behind them, Charleston woke to find every public clock stopped at 11:11. Dr. Bell, waking in his rooms, found the folio restored to his desk, the pages stitched together with what looked like human hair. The ink had darkened overnight to a purple so deep it seemed to swallow the lamplight. He tried to burn the pages. The fire refused them, parting like water around a stone. He tried to drown them in the basin. The water thickened to blood and would not drain. At last he carried them to the college library and attempted to bury them in the folio stacks. But each book he touched fell open to reveal the same sentences printed in its gutter, as if the letter had propagated like mold. Grimke, encountering him there, advised that the only remaining repository was the mind. Bell must memorize the text and then destroy the vessel that held it, his own skull. The professor laughed, a sound like chalk snapping, and asked how one forgets a thing that has already begun to read you. Grimke replied that oblivion is merely memory folded inward, then offered a scalpel small enough to enter the ear. Bell declined, but that night he dreamt of the library again, its shelves now lined with jars containing miniature brains, each pulsing with the same vein-lit word. One jar was empty. On its label was written his name. He woke to find the scalpel on his pillow, hair-wrapped handle still warm. Meanwhile, Adelaide King's plantation had begun to exhale its own ruin. The rice fields, flooded for winter, turned black overnight, the water glossy as obsidian. When the overseer probed with a pole, the bottom felt ribbed, as if the earth had grown a spine. The pecan tree split down its center. the two halves leaning apart like doors. Inside, the heartwood had been carved into a spiral staircase descending into darkness that smelled of river silt. The quarters stood empty. Every slave had vanished, leaving behind only the clothes they had worn, folded neatly at the foot of each pallet. In the cook's cabin, the ash of her fire had been raked into the shape of an open eye. Adelaide walked the veranda at dawn, Ruth beside her, both women speaking in low tones as though negotiating a treaty with the air itself. They agreed that the body must be returned, not to the college but to the plantation, to the split tree, to the wound in the land that had never healed. They sent no message. Instead, they waited, knowing that what is owned will find its way home when the leash is reversed. Back in Charleston, Bell felt the summons as a pressure behind the eyes, a compulsion to travel south that grew stronger each hour. He tried to resist by dosing himself with laudanum. The drug produced dreams in which he stood in a lecture hall addressing rows of cadavers who applauded by knocking their knuckles together. When he woke, his own knuckles were bruised. At last he ordered the corpse crated for transport, telling the college trustees that further dissection must be performed in the field, where atmospheric conditions might explain the anomalies of preservation. He hired a wagon, a driver, and 2 armed guards, both former slave catchers, then set out at dawn, the crate lashed behind him like a portable tomb. The journey along the Ashley Road took 6 hours. Each mile the horses sweated more profusely, though the air was cold enough to frost their breath. At the ferry, the same pilot who had refused Adelaide now welcomed Bell without a word, eyes fixed on the crate as though it contained his own future. Mid-river, the boat stalled. The current reversed itself, flowing upstream for the space of 11 heartbeats, long enough for the guards to cross themselves. On the far bank, the road was lined with pecan shells arranged in double rows, a breadcrumb trail of cracked hearts. As the wagon passed, the shells cracked further, releasing a scent of green lightning that made the horses roll their eyes. By late afternoon, the party reached the plantation. The house stood open, every shutter banging though the air was still. Adelaide awaited them on the veranda, dressed in mourning that had once been white, now stained the color of river fog. She greeted Bell without surprise, as though he were a guest long expected, then led the way to the split tree. The guards refused to leave the wagon. The driver fell to his knees, vomiting what looked like ink. Bell and the professor's assistant, a boy of 19 named Poe, no kin to the author, dragged the crate beneath the leaning halves of the trunk. Adelaide produced a key, not iron but bone, yellow and carved with the same Greek word. The crate opened without a sound. Inside, the corpse lay as before, eyes closed, hands folded, the derringer now placed between the palms like a metal prayer. Adelaide instructed that the body be carried to the base of the staircase carved within the tree. Bell, unable to resist, obeyed. As they descended, the light dimmed to a bruise-colored glow that rose from the wood itself. The air grew warmer, smelling of river silt, of rice starch, of lamp oil burned decades ago. The spiral ended in a chamber whose walls were lined with pages, hundreds, thousands, each covered in the same handwriting, the confiscated letter multiplied into a wallpaper of confession. At the center stood a chair carved from the same heartwood, its arms worn smooth by countless elbows. Into this chair they placed the corpse. The moment its weight settled, the pages stirred, rustling toward the center as if drawn by a tide. Then she turned and climbed the stairs, Bell following, the assistant last. Behind them, the chamber sealed itself. The pages folded inward, origami of memory, until the cavity became a knot once more. Outside, the tree groaned, the two halves leaning together until the split disappeared, bark knitting over the wound like a scar that has decided to forget. Night fell sudden and absolute. From the veranda, the three watchers saw the rice fields drain themselves, black water withdrawing into the earth until the terraces gleamed like empty mirrors. In each mirror, a star reflected, though the sky was clouded. Somewhere beneath, the corpse sat reading itself forever, the derringer balanced on one knee, waiting for the trigger that would fire upward through the trunk and split the pecan anew. But no hand would ever again pull that trigger. The debt had merely changed creditors. Adelaide felt the silver dollar in her pocket dissolve, leaving only the hole, a circle through which the night wind blew, cold as the memory of a word never spoken. Behind her, Ruth began to hum again, but the tune had no end, looping upon itself the way a noose loops, the way a river loops, the way a story loops when the teller refuses to die. Weeks passed, or perhaps months. The calendars in the big house had stopped acknowledging time, their pages glued together by salt damp. Adelaide no longer left the veranda. She sat in a rocker that moved without her, eyes fixed on the pecan tree, waiting for the crack that would signal the second opening. Bell remained as guest, though guest was too mild a word. He moved through the rooms like a man walking the corridors of his own evacuated skull. He tried to take notes, but ink bled sideways across the paper, forming the same looping diagram of the Mobius strip. At night, he heard lectures drifting up from the tree, lessons in anatomy delivered in a voice that might have been his own. The assistant Poe grew feverish, speaking of numbers that walked, of ratios that coupled like dogs. One dawn he was found in the rice terraces, face down in the cracked mud, arms spread as if measuring wingspan. His back was unmarked, but his mouth was packed with pecan shells crushed to powder. They buried him beneath the kitchen garden. By evening a sapling had sprouted, leaves black, fruit bitter. Ruth tended it as though it were a child, singing lullabies in a language that predated the Middle Passage. Adelaide, observing her, understood that the girl was no longer entirely property, no longer entirely free, but something in between, a translator for the debt. One night the widow attempted to burn the tree. The flames crawled upward, then snapped back, extinguished by the wood itself, which exhaled a gust that smelled of rice starch and lamp oil. In the morning the trunk was unblemished, but the big house shutters had blistered, paint curling into letters that spelled "Sophos" in tiny burns. Bell, confronting the word, felt the last thread of his skepticism unravel. He asked Adelaide for permission to descend again. She replied that permission was no longer hers to give, but that the tree would open for the bearer of the correct question. The bark parted. He descended alone. The chamber had changed. The pages were gone, replaced by mirrors, dozens, hundreds, each reflecting not the viewer, but the moment the viewer would die. Bell saw himself elderly, stroke-twisted, mouthing a student's name. He saw himself infant, skull soft, fontanelle pulsing to the rhythm of a ticking clock. He saw himself as he was now, standing in a room whose walls were the inside of his own cranium, veins glowing like lantern wicks. At the center sat the corpse, unchanged except that the derringer had been fired. A hole gaped in the crown of the skull, edges cauterized, the bullet missing. The corpse spoke, though the mouth did not move. Lesson 1. To dissect is to remember. Lesson 2. To remember is to owe. Bell felt the scalpel in his pocket grow warm, then hot. He drew it out, blade glowing red. The corpse extended a hand, palm upward. Into it Bell placed the scalpel, unable to refuse. The corpse pressed the blade to its own sternum and carved a doorway, ribs parting like curtains. Inside the cavity lay not organs, but a miniature plantation, the big house, the rice fields, the pecan tree, all carved from bone. Within the tiny tree sat a tinier Bell, holding a tinier scalpel, ad infinitum. The professor understood then that dissection was not a science but a form of inheritance, each cut bequeathing the view to the next in line. He turned to leave. The mirrors followed, reflecting only the back of his head, a view he had never seen. As he climbed the stairs, each step erased itself behind him. By the time he emerged, the trunk had sealed, the scar now invisible even to memory. Outside, Adelaide waited. She looked at him as one might look at a clock that has struck 13. Fascinated, but aware the mechanism is now useless for telling time. Bell said nothing. He walked to the river, removed his shoes, and waded in until the water reached his waist. There he stood, staring downstream, waiting for the current to decide his fate. The river, however, refused to move. It glassed around him, reflecting not the sky but the inside of the chemical vault, the corpse seated, the scalpel still glowing. Bell understood that he had become a footnote in a text that wrote itself backward, each word erasing the previous. He left the water, shoes still dry, and returned to the house, now empty even of echoes. Adelaide had vanished. The rocker moved without her, propelled by the wind that blew through the hole in the silver dollar, a wind that smelled of old paper and rice starch. Ruth stood at the foot of the stairs, eyes yellowish in the lamplight, the same shade Daniel King's eyes had been. She spoke Bell's name, though he had never told it to her. She spoke it in 3 languages at once, the syllables overlapping like gears. Then she too turned and walked into the marsh, footprints filling with ink that wrote brief sentences before soaking away. Bell remained alone, the last creditor in a foreclosure that had no sheriff. He tried to leave. The road circled back to the pecan tree. He tried to burn the tree. The matches lit only his own shadow, which burned like a fuse, regenerating each morning. At last he entered the big house, sat at the judge's desk, and began to write. He wrote not with ink, but with the scalpel, carving each letter into the walnut surface. The words were the confiscated letter, reproduced in full. When he reached the final diagram, the desk split along the grain, revealing a hollow space containing a single object, the derringer, unfired, bullet still seated. He lifted the weapon, felt its weight identical to the moment before a lecture begins, when the hall is hushed and knowledge has not yet become cruelty. He placed the barrel to his temple, but the trigger refused to move. The mechanism had been reversed, the debt now requiring not death but continuance. Bell lowered the gun, felt the last of his resistance drain away like water from a cracked vessel. Outside, the pecan tree split again, but only wide enough for a breath. Through the crack drifted the smell of river silt, of rice starch, of lamp oil burned decades ago. He walked toward it, feet moving without command, the same way a sentence moves toward the period that has already been inscribed. Behind him, the big house exhaled a sigh that sounded like the word sophos, repeated until it became not a word but a wound that would never close. And so the plantation waited, patient as a ledger, for the next owner to arrive, the next reader to open the book that had already read him. Years later, though how many is impossible to count since the clocks had surrendered, travelers still spoke of a house south of the Ashley, where the road loops back upon itself, where a pecan tree stands whole yet split, where a man in a professor's coat can be seen walking the circumference of the fields, footprints filling with ink that writes brief sentences before soaking away. They say if you offer him a coin, he hands back a hole. They say the tree opens only for those who carry a debt they cannot name, and that inside is a chair carved from heartwood, and a book whose pages are mirrors, and a corpse that smiles as if it has already solved the equation of your life. But these are only stories, the kind told around fires that refuse to warm, the kind that end not with a period, but with a wound that seeps whenever the tale is recalled. And somewhere beneath the tree, the ticking continues. Not a clock, but a heartbeat. Not a heartbeat, but a lecture. Not a lecture, but a confession that has forgotten how to end. The debt remains unpaid, the interest compounds, and the curriculum waits for the next student to raise his hand, to open his mouth, to speak the word that will begin the lesson anew.